The train whistle echoed across the Pennsylvania countryside on a crisp morning in November 1943, its haunting call cutting through the autumn air like a blade through silk. Inside one of the cattle cars, pressed against the wooden slats with dozens of other captured German soldiers, Obergefreiter Klaus Müller caught his first glimpse of America through a narrow gap in the planking. What he saw would shatter everything he had been told about his enemy and change his understanding of the war forever. An endless procession of freight trains stretched along parallel tracks as far as the eye could see, each one pulling what seemed like hundreds of cars loaded with tanks, artillery pieces, aircraft engines, and mountains of supplies covered by green canvas tarps. But it wasn't just one train. As Müller's transport crawled eastward toward the prisoner of war camp that would be his home for the next 2 years, he counted convoy after convoy rolling in the opposite direction, all heading toward the Atlantic ports where Liberty ships waited to carry American war materiel to Europe. "Mein Gott," whispered the soldier pressed against him, a veteran of the Africa Corps who had been captured at Tunisia. "How many tanks do the Americans have?" It was a question that would haunt thousands of German prisoners as they were transported across a continent that seemed to pulse with industrial might. These men, who had been told that America was a nation of soft civilians incapable of serious warfare, were witnessing the greatest mobilization of productive capacity in human history. The shock on their faces was understandable. Most of these prisoners had spent years fighting a war of scarcity, where every bullet had to be rationed and every drop of fuel carefully conserved. They came from a Germany where factories worked around the clock to produce weapons that never seemed adequate to meet the demands of fighting on multiple fronts. Now they found themselves in a country where the highways groaned under the weight of endless truck convoys, where trains longer than entire German villages carried more military equipment than some Wehrmacht divisions had ever seen. Klaus Müller had enlisted in the Wehrmacht in 1940, filled with the confidence that came from watching German armies sweep across Europe with seemingly unstoppable momentum. He had marched through France as part of Army Group A, had seen the supposedly mighty French military collapse in just 6 weeks. He had fought in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, watching Soviet forces retreat in apparent chaos before the disciplined advance of German mechanized units. Like most German soldiers, he had been raised on stories of German technological superiority and the inherent weakness of democratic societies. But the America he was seeing through that cattle car window bore no resemblance to the caricature painted by Nazi propaganda. This wasn't a nation of jazz-obsessed weaklings and money-grubbing capitalists. This was an industrial colossus that seemed capable of producing war material on a scale that defied comprehension. Every mile of track revealed new evidence of American productive capacity. Aircraft factories the size of small cities, tank assembly lines that stretched beyond the horizon, ammunition plants that worked around the clock with a precision that would have impressed German engineers. The journey from the East Coast Processing Center to Camp Alva in Oklahoma would take 3 days, and every hour brought new revelations about the true nature of American industrial power. At rail yards in Pennsylvania and Ohio, Müller watched switching engines organize freight trains that seemed to go on forever. Each car was loaded with military equipment, jeeps stacked 3 high, artillery pieces wrapped in protective canvas, crates of ammunition marked with destinations from England to Australia to the Soviet Union. What struck the German prisoners most forcefully wasn't just the quantity of equipment, but the casual abundance with which it was handled. American railroad workers moved among the freight cars with an efficiency that spoke of long practice and unlimited resources. There was no sense of urgency or desperation, no careful rationing of precious materials. Instead, there was the calm confidence of a system that could produce whatever was needed, whenever it was needed, in quantities that seemed almost limitless. The contrast with their own experience was devastating. German soldiers had learned to treasure every piece of equipment, to repair and maintain weapons and vehicles with a care born of necessity. They had fought battles where the outcome was determined by which side ran out of ammunition first, where a broken-down tank had to be abandoned because replacement parts were simply unavailable. Now they were seeing a military machine that seemed to operate on completely different principles, where abundance rather than scarcity was the defining characteristic. As their train crossed into Ohio, the prisoners caught sight of something that would become one of the most enduring images of their captivity: the Willow Run bomber plant, Henry Ford's massive facility for producing B-24 Liberator bombers. The building itself was so large that it created its own weather patterns, with clouds forming inside the structure on humid days. But it was the parking lot that truly captured the prisoners' attention. Thousands upon thousands of automobiles stretched in neat rows as far as the eye could see, each one representing a worker who had driven to the factory in his own private vehicle. The sight was almost incomprehensible to men who came from a country where private automobile ownership was rare even before the war. Here was evidence not just of American industrial capacity, but of American prosperity on a scale that seemed almost fantastical. These weren't just workers. They were workers wealthy enough to own cars, well-fed enough to work long shifts, and motivated enough to produce the bombers that were systematically destroying German cities. The psychological impact of these revelations cannot be overstated. German military doctrine had been built around the assumption of qualitative superiority over quantitatively superior enemies. German tanks might be outnumbered, but they were supposedly better designed and better crewed. German aircraft might face numerical disadvantages, but German pilots were supposedly more skilled and German engineering more advanced. The entire German war effort was predicated on the belief that superior training, technology, and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. But the America the prisoners were seeing challenged every one of these assumptions. The trucks and trains rolling past their windows weren't just numerous. They were sophisticated, well-maintained, and operated with a precision that spoke of advanced logistics and superior organization. The workers they glimpsed at rail yards and factories weren't the soft civilians of Nazi propaganda, but confident, capable people who seemed to take their nation's industrial supremacy for granted. The train carrying Klaus Müller and his fellow prisoners made frequent stops to allow military freight trains to pass, and each stop provided new opportunities to observe American logistics in action. At a rail yard in Indiana, they watched as a convoy of tank cars filled with aviation gasoline was assembled for shipment to the West Coast. The sheer quantity of fuel represented by those cars would have kept an entire Luftwaffe squadron flying for months, yet it was just one of dozens of similar convoys they observed during their journey. The efficiency of American railroad operations was particularly impressive to German observers who had grown accustomed to the increasingly chaotic state of their own transportation system. By 1943, Allied bombing had severely disrupted German rail networks, forcing military planners to route supplies through circuitous paths that added days or weeks to delivery times. American railroads, by contrast, operated with clockwork precision, moving vast quantities of military supplies across continental distances with apparent ease. But it wasn't just the scale of American production that impressed the German prisoners. It was the sophistication of the logistics system that supported it. Every piece of equipment they observed was carefully labeled and tracked, part of a supply chain that could move specific items from factories in Detroit to battlefields in Italy with remarkable speed and accuracy. This wasn't the crude mass production of a primitive industrial system, but the refined output of the world's most advanced manufacturing economy. The prisoners' train passed through Chicago in the early hours of the morning, and even in the pre-dawn darkness, the city pulsed with industrial activity. Steel mills glowed red against the night sky, their furnaces working around the clock to produce the raw materials for America's war machine. Railroad yards stretched for miles in every direction, filled with freight cars carrying everything from wheat to aircraft engines. The sheer scale of the operation was overwhelming, representing an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything in Europe. As dawn broke over the Illinois prairie, the prisoners caught sight of something that would become a recurring theme throughout their journey: the casual waste that seemed to characterize American military logistics. At a rail siding, they observed dozens of trucks that had been abandoned rather than repaired, their minor mechanical problems apparently not worth the effort of fixing. To German soldiers who had learned to cannibalize broken equipment for spare parts, this casual disposal of repairable vehicles was almost shocking. But what the prisoners interpreted as waste was actually evidence of a production system so efficient that replacement was often more economical than repair. American factories were producing new trucks faster than mechanics could fix old ones, creating a logistics philosophy based on abundance rather than conservation. It was a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that prioritized speed and reliability over economy and efficiency. The journey west continued through Missouri and Kansas, each mile revealing new evidence of American industrial might. Ammunition plants dotted the landscape like small cities, their smokestacks reaching toward the sky like monuments to American productive capacity. Aircraft factories sprawled across hundreds of acres, their assembly lines visible through massive windows that seemed to stretch forever. Tank production facilities covered areas larger than entire German towns, their parking lots filled with completed vehicles waiting for shipment to ports on both coasts. But perhaps most impressive of all were the training facilities that the prisoners observed throughout their journey. Airfields seemed to appear every few miles, each one filled with training aircraft and student pilots learning to fly the bombers and fighters that would soon be deployed against Germany. Tank training grounds stretched across vast areas of prairie, where new crews learned to operate the Sherman tanks that were rolling off American assembly lines by the thousands. The scale of American pilot training was particularly sobering for German prisoners who had served in the Luftwaffe. By 1943, German pilot training had been severely curtailed due to fuel shortages and the need to use experienced pilots in combat roles. American training programs, by contrast, seemed to operate without any resource constraints whatsoever. Student pilots flew for hours every day, burning fuel that would have been precious beyond measure in Germany, learning skills that would make them formidable opponents in the skies over Europe. As their train crossed into Oklahoma, Klaus Müller found himself grappling with the implications of what he had witnessed. The America he had seen through that cattle car window was not the weak, divided nation described in German propaganda. It was a unified, confident country that had mobilized its vast resources for war with devastating effectiveness. The endless convoys of trucks and trains weren't just impressive displays of industrial capacity. They were harbingers of Germany's inevitable defeat. The other prisoners seemed to be reaching similar conclusions. Conversations that had once focused on when Germany would develop new wonder weapons or when the Western Allies would exhaust themselves in costly offensives now turned to more fundamental questions about the nature of the war they had been fighting. How could Germany hope to defeat a nation that could casually produce more military equipment than the Reich had ever possessed? How could the Wehrmacht compete with an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources and unlimited time? These questions would become even more pressing as the prisoners settled into their new lives in American POW camps, where they would have years to observe American society and contemplate the forces that had brought them to defeat. But already, during those 3 days crossing the American continent, the foundations of their worldview had been shaken by the simple reality of American industrial supremacy. The train whistle that had announced their arrival in America had been more than just a sound. It had been the voice of a new world order, one in which industrial capacity rather than military tradition would determine the fate of nations. The endless convoys of trucks and trains that the prisoners had observed were not just logistical operations. They were demonstrations of power on a scale that would reshape the global balance of forces for generations to come. As Camp Alva appeared on the horizon, its guard towers and barbed wire fences marking the end of their journey across America, Klaus Müller and his fellow prisoners carried with them a burden of knowledge that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had seen the true face of their enemy, and it was not the face of soldiers or sailors or airmen. It was the face of an industrial civilization that could produce war materiel faster than Germany could destroy it, that could train new pilots faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down, that could build new ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The implications of this revelation would only become clearer in the months and years that followed, as the prisoners settled into the routine of camp life and had time to reflect on what they had witnessed. But the seeds of understanding had been planted during those 3 days on the rails, watching America's endless convoy of trucks and trains roll past their windows like a mechanized river flowing toward victory. The gates of Camp Alva clanged shut behind Klaus Müller and his fellow prisoners, with a finality that seemed to echo across the Oklahoma plains. But if the German soldiers expected to find themselves in a harsh, punitive environment designed to break their spirits, they were in for another shock that would further challenge their preconceptions about American society. The camp that would house them for the duration of the war was not the brutal prison they had imagined, but a well-organized facility that operated with the same industrial efficiency they had observed during their cross-country journey. Camp Alva was one of over 500 prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the United States, housing more than 400,000 German prisoners by the war's end. The camp itself was a small city, complete with barracks, mess halls, recreational facilities, and even workshops where prisoners could learn new trades. But what struck the German soldiers most immediately was not the physical infrastructure of the camp, but the casual abundance that seemed to characterize every aspect of American military operations, even in a prison facility. The first meal served to the new arrivals became the stuff of legend among the prisoners. After years of increasingly meager rations in the German army, where ersatz coffee and black bread had become luxuries, the prisoners found themselves confronted with portions that seemed almost obscene in their generosity. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute they had grown accustomed to in Germany. Fresh meat in quantities that many hadn't seen since before the war. White bread that was softer and more flavorful than anything available to German civilians, even in peacetime. Obergefreiter Hans Weber, a tank crewman who had been captured in Tunisia alongside Müller, stared at his dinner tray in disbelief. "They feed their prisoners better than we fed our own soldiers," he whispered to his bunkmate. It was an observation that would be repeated countless times throughout the camps, as German prisoners struggled to reconcile the reality of American abundance with everything they had been told about their enemy's supposed weakness and decadence. But the food was just the beginning of a series of revelations that would fundamentally alter the prisoners' understanding of American society. The camp library, stocked with thousands of books and magazines, provided access to information that had been carefully filtered or completely suppressed in Nazi Germany. American newspapers, even those critical of government policies, were available for the prisoners to read, offering perspectives on the war that contradicted everything they had learned from German propaganda. The prisoners discovered that American newspapers regularly published casualty figures, criticized military strategies, and even questioned government decisions in ways that would have been unthinkable in Nazi Germany. This wasn't the sign of weakness that German propaganda had suggested, but evidence of a society confident enough in its strength to tolerate dissent and debate. The very existence of such open criticism seemed to indicate a level of social stability and democratic maturity that challenged German assumptions about the inherent superiority of authoritarian systems. Even more surprising was the treatment the prisoners received from their American guards. The Geneva Convention was scrupulously observed, with prisoners receiving the same rations as American soldiers and access to medical care that was often superior to what they had received in their own army. Guards who had lost brothers or friends in the European theater nevertheless treated their charges with professional courtesy, displaying a discipline and restraint that impressed even veteran German soldiers. Captain James Morrison, the camp commander, was a former high school principal from Iowa who had been called to military service after Pearl Harbor. His approach to managing the prisoner population reflected the same pragmatic efficiency that characterized American industrial operations. Rather than viewing the prisoners as enemies to be punished, Morrison saw them as a resource to be managed productively. Prisoners who demonstrated good behavior and useful skills were assigned to work details that supported the American war effort, earning wages that they could use to purchase additional food and supplies from the camp commissary. This work program provided the prisoners with their most intimate exposure to American industrial methods and social organization. German soldiers who had been trained as mechanics found themselves maintaining American military vehicles with tools and equipment that surpassed anything they had used in the Wehrmacht. The quality of American hand tools, the precision of American measuring instruments, and the reliability of American machinery impressed even prisoners who had been raised on stories of German engineering superiority. Klaus Müller was assigned to a work detail at a nearby airfield, where he helped maintain the training aircraft used to prepare American pilots for combat. The experience was both fascinating and deeply disturbing for a man who had served in the Luftwaffe and witnessed its steady decline throughout 1943. The American training program operated on a scale that dwarfed anything Germany had ever attempted, with student pilots flying multiple missions every day in aircraft that seemed to be available in unlimited quantities. The casual abundance of aviation fuel was particularly striking to Müller, who remembered the increasingly desperate fuel shortages that had grounded much of the Luftwaffe by the time of his capture. American training flights burned more fuel in a single day than many German squadrons had available for an entire month. Yet there was never any indication that fuel supplies were limited or that conservation was necessary. The Americans seemed to operate on the assumption that whatever resources they needed would always be available. But it wasn't just the quantity of resources that impressed the German prisoners. It was the sophistication of the training methods and the quality of the instruction. American flight instructors used standardized curricula and training materials that ensured consistent, high-quality preparation for all students. German pilot training, by contrast, had become increasingly haphazard as the war progressed, with experienced instructors pulled away for combat duties and training programs shortened to meet immediate operational needs. The prisoners working at the airfield also observed the steady stream of new aircraft arriving from American factories. These weren't just training planes, but frontline fighters and bombers that represented the latest advances in American aviation technology. The P-51 Mustang fighters that began appearing in late 1943 were particularly impressive, combining speed, range, and firepower in ways that clearly surpassed anything in the German arsenal. Perhaps most sobering of all was the realization that these advanced aircraft were being produced not in small numbers by specialized craftsmen, but on assembly lines that could turn out dozens of planes per day. The industrial methods that Henry Ford had pioneered for automobile production were being applied to aircraft manufacturing with devastating effectiveness. American factories were producing fighters and bombers with the same efficiency that they had once used to build cars and trucks. The work details also exposed the prisoners to American civilian workers, providing insights into a society that seemed to operate on fundamentally different principles than Nazi Germany. The American workers they encountered were not the oppressed proletariat described in German propaganda, but confident, well-paid individuals who took obvious pride in their contributions to the war effort. Many of these workers owned their own homes, drove their own cars, and enjoyed living standards that exceeded those of most German middle-class families, even before the war. The relationship between American workers and their supervisors was particularly striking to German observers who had been raised in a highly hierarchical society. American foremen and managers treated their workers with a respect and collegiality that would have been unusual in German factories. Decisions were often made through discussion and consensus, rather than through rigid chains of command. This democratic approach to industrial organization seemed to produce better results than the authoritarian methods favored in Germany. The prisoners also had opportunities to observe American agricultural methods during work assignments at nearby farms. The mechanization of American agriculture was far more advanced than anything they had seen in Europe, with individual farmers operating machinery that could accomplish the work of dozens of laborers. Tractors, combines, and other farm equipment were not only more numerous, but more sophisticated than their European counterparts, representing a level of technological advancement that extended far beyond military applications. The abundance of American agriculture was perhaps even more impressive than the country's industrial capacity. Farmers who contracted with the government to employ prisoner labor often provided meals for their workers that included fresh meat, dairy products, and vegetables in quantities that seemed almost wasteful to men who had grown accustomed to wartime rationing. The casual disposal of food that would have been precious in Germany, bread crusts thrown to chickens, milk poured out when it was slightly sour, provided constant reminders of the vast difference in living standards between the two countries. These agricultural work details also revealed the extent to which American farming had been mechanized and modernized. German agriculture, even before the war, had relied heavily on manual labor and animal power. American farms, by contrast, were highly mechanized operations that could produce enormous quantities of food with relatively few workers. This agricultural efficiency was crucial to America's ability to feed not only its own population, but also its allies around the world, while simultaneously supporting the largest military force in the nation's history. The prisoners' exposure to American popular culture provided another window into a society that defied German stereotypes. The camp's recreation hall was equipped with a radio that received civilian broadcasts, exposing the prisoners to American music, comedy shows, and news programs. Rather than the decadent jazz and mindless entertainment that German propaganda had described, the prisoners encountered a vibrant cultural life that seemed to reflect the confidence and optimism of a society at war, but not at risk. American popular music in particular challenged German preconceptions about American culture. The big band sounds of Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey, the patriotic songs of Irving Berlin, and the emerging folk music of Woody Guthrie revealed a culture that was both sophisticated and deeply rooted in democratic values. These weren't the products of a decadent society, but expressions of a confident civilization that could maintain its cultural life even while mobilizing for total war. The camp's movie nights provided even more dramatic evidence of American cultural sophistication. Hollywood films from the early 1940s revealed production values and technical achievements that surpassed anything coming out of German studios. But more importantly, these films reflected social attitudes and values that contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught about American society. Rather than the crude materialism and social decay described in Nazi propaganda, American films portrayed a society that valued individual achievement, democratic participation, and social mobility. The prisoners were particularly struck by the portrayal of American women in these films. Rather than the weak, frivolous creatures of German stereotypes, American women were depicted as capable, independent individuals who could contribute meaningfully to society and the war effort. This portrayal was confirmed by the prisoners' observations of real American women working in factories, farms, and military facilities. The Rosie the Riveter phenomenon was not just propaganda. It represented a genuine transformation of American society that was directly contributing to the war effort. The mail system that connected the prisoners with their families in Germany provided another source of disturbing comparisons. Letters from home described increasingly desperate conditions in German cities, with food shortages, fuel shortages, and the constant threat of Allied bombing raids. Meanwhile, letters from American families to camp personnel described a society that seemed to be thriving despite the war. American civilians were earning higher wages, buying new homes, and planning for a prosperous post-war future. This contrast was particularly evident in the packages that prisoners occasionally received from German relief organizations. These packages, when they arrived at all, contained items that reflected the severe shortages plaguing the German home front: ersatz coffee, synthetic foods, and clothing made from inferior materials. American care packages sent to their own troops, which the prisoners sometimes observed, contained luxuries that would have been unimaginable to German civilians: real chocolate, cigarettes, canned fruits, and other delicacies. The educational programs available to prisoners provided yet another revelation about American society. Camp Alva offered classes in English, mathematics, science, and various trades, taught by qualified instructors who treated their German students with the same professionalism they would have shown to American pupils. The quality of instruction and the availability of educational materials reflected a society that valued learning and self-improvement, even for its enemies. Many prisoners took advantage of these educational opportunities to learn skills that would serve them well in the post-war world. Klaus Müller enrolled in an automotive mechanics course, learning to work on American engines and electrical systems that were far more sophisticated than their German counterparts. The course materials, tools, and practice vehicles provided for this training represented an investment in prisoner education that would have been unthinkable in a German POW camp. The medical care available to prisoners provided perhaps the most dramatic evidence of American abundance and humanitarian values. The camp hospital was staffed by qualified doctors and nurses who provided treatment that was often superior to what the prisoners had received in their own army. Dental care, in particular, was a revelation for men who had grown accustomed to primitive field dentistry. American military dentists used modern equipment and techniques to provide care that restored not just function, but comfort and appearance. The pharmaceutical supplies available to treat prisoner ailments included medications that were rare or unavailable in Germany. Sulfur drugs, which had revolutionized the treatment of infections, were used routinely to treat even minor ailments among the prisoners. Pain medications, vitamins, and other medical supplies were available in quantities that reflected a society that could afford to maintain high standards of care, even for its enemies. As 1944 progressed, and news of the war filtered into the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts, the prisoners found themselves confronting the inevitable conclusion of the conflict they had helped to start. The D-Day landings in June 1944 were reported in American newspapers with a detail and immediacy that would have been impossible in German media. The prisoners could follow the progress of Allied forces across France in real time, watching as the industrial might they had observed during their journey across America was brought to bear on the European battlefield. The scale of the D-Day operation was particularly sobering for men who had participated in German military planning. The ability to transport, supply, and coordinate such a massive amphibious assault across the English Channel demonstrated logistical capabilities that dwarfed anything Germany had ever attempted. The thousands of ships, aircraft, and vehicles involved in the operation represented just a fraction of American and British productive capacity, yet they constituted a force larger than many entire armies. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the casual confidence with which American officials discussed the operation. There was no sense of desperate gamble or last-ditch effort, but rather the methodical execution of a plan that had been years in the making. The Americans and British had not just assembled the forces necessary for the invasion. They had done so while simultaneously conducting operations in Italy, the Pacific, and other theaters around the world. As winter approached and the prisoners settled into what they now realized would be a long captivity, the full implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in. The endless convoys of trucks and trains they had observed during their journey across America were not anomalies. They were the visible manifestation of an industrial system that had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare itself. Germany had not just lost a series of battles, it had been overwhelmed by a type of power that it had never fully understood or appreciated. The America they had discovered was not the weak, divided nation of Nazi propaganda, but a unified, confident civilization that had mobilized its vast resources with devastating effectiveness. The trucks and trains, the factories and farms, the schools and hospitals they had observed, all reflected a society that could sustain total war while actually improving the living standards of its population. It was a demonstration of power that would reshape the global balance of forces for generations to come, and the German prisoners who witnessed it firsthand would carry that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. The winter of 1944 brought news that would forever shatter any remaining illusions the German prisoners might have harbored about their nation's chances of victory. Through American newspapers and radio broadcasts, they learned of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last desperate offensive in the West. What should have been reported as a German triumph, the initial surprise and breakthrough that caught American forces off guard, instead became a lesson in the inexorable mathematics of industrial warfare. Klaus Müller and his fellow prisoners followed the battle's progress with the keen interest of professional soldiers, but also with the growing dread of men who understood what the outcome would mean. The initial German success, achieved through careful planning and the element of surprise, had indeed pushed American forces back and created a dangerous salient in Allied lines. For a brief moment, it seemed as though German tactical skill might still be capable of achieving decisive results. But then the full weight of American industrial might came crashing down on the German offensive like an avalanche. Within days, American factories were working around the clock to replace the equipment lost in the initial assault. Truck convoys that dwarfed anything the prisoners had seen during their cross-country journey began flowing toward the Ardennes, carrying ammunition, fuel, and replacement vehicles in quantities that seemed almost supernatural. Most devastating of all, American aircraft appeared over the battlefield in such numbers that they literally darkened the sky. The prisoners listened in stunned silence as radio reports described the scale of the American response. Over 250,000 troops were redeployed to contain the German breakthrough, many of them transported by truck convoys that covered hundreds of miles in just a few days. The logistical precision required to coordinate such a massive movement of men and materiel was staggering, but even more staggering was the casual confidence with which American commanders discussed the operation. There was no sense of panic or desperate improvisation in the American response, but rather the methodical application of overwhelming force. American generals spoke of the German offensive not as a crisis to be survived, but as an opportunity to destroy German reserves in a decisive engagement. The industrial machine that the prisoners had observed during their journey across America was responding to the challenge with the same efficiency it had shown in peacetime production. The air campaign that accompanied the American ground response was particularly sobering for former Luftwaffe personnel among the prisoners. American and British aircraft flew over 15,000 sorties during the battle, a number that exceeded the total operational strength of the Luftwaffe at that point in the war. The casual expenditure of aviation fuel, ammunition, and aircraft represented resources that Germany could no longer even dream of matching. But it wasn't just the scale of the American response that impressed the prisoners. It was the sophistication of the logistics system that supported it. Radio reports described supply operations that could deliver specific types of ammunition to particular units within hours of a request being made. Wounded soldiers were evacuated by air to hospitals hundreds of miles away, where they received medical care that surpassed anything available to German forces. Even in the midst of a major battle, American forces operated with a level of logistical support that seemed almost luxurious to men who had grown accustomed to chronic shortages. The outcome of the Battle of the Bulge was never really in doubt once the initial surprise had worn off. German forces, operating at the end of supply lines that could barely sustain them, were systematically ground down by American units that seemed to have unlimited access to fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. By January 1945, the German offensive had not only been contained, but had resulted in the destruction of Germany's last strategic reserves. The prisoners in Camp Alva received this news with a mixture of professional admiration and personal despair. As soldiers, they could appreciate the skill with which American forces had responded to the crisis. As Germans, they understood that the failure of the Ardennes offensive meant that their homeland now lay defenseless before the advancing Allied armies. The industrial superiority they had witnessed during their journey across America was about to be brought to bear directly on German soil.